Welcome in and welcome back. We are here for Ask Adrian Anything number 11, and this is going to be an episode all about writing. Are you tilted? No, I don't think that did anything at all. It'll be okay. We have here a series of questions for Ask Adrian Anything 11, and all of these questions have to do with writing. Number 1 comes to us from Ina, who says, do you believe in the thought that to write, you have to live? Now, I think this might be asking one of two questions that come in a more common parlance as this: do you have to write what you know? Or number 2, do you have to live a little to fill up the cup before pouring it out? This is to write one's experiences, not necessarily what one knows. So I'm going to do my best to answer both of these questions in some type of fashion. Do you have to write what you know? I think that it is important to at least know about what you write. So, for example, if you were to write a story about someone who works in retail, it is not necessary to have had worked retail, but you've been into Walmart, you've been into the Walgreens, you've been into these places where people do retail type things. You went to Best Buy before the apocalypse. You went to, those movie rental places. I can't remember what any of them are called now. They've been gone for so long. You know enough about them to you don't have to get into the nitty-gritties of things in order to make things work with a story, because hypothetically, the story in question will not be about the standard closing procedures for your local Walgreens. It will be about the individuals involved. That said, Stephen King made the observation on writing that people enjoy reading about nothing more than they enjoy reading about work. And if Stephen King says that, I'm not going to necessarily argue with him, but what I would do is say maybe to an extent with some types of stories. But one of the things that often sticks in my craw when reading Hemingway, for example, no one's ever at work. None of these people ever have jobs. So that is great literature coming from Hemingway, but it is not necessarily always the most interesting with what is going on. Hemingway also said, be sure you do not confuse action with movement. I think a lot of times the workplace becomes movement in literature, in writing, in fiction, as opposed to action. One person who is really good at integrating the two is James Joyce. Now, I don't know a whole lot about James Joyce's life, but I doubt he had all of the occupations that he wrote about and wrote convincingly about in The Dubliners. And what James Joyce was masterful at doing in his work was making the work of the individual important to the character. Not just it's important this guy has a job, but what does that job say about the individual in question? A lot of this with Joyce had to do with class, but also the mundane nature of work and what that does to someone. So if someone has a non-mundane job, do they make that job mundane, and what does that say about them? Maybe someone, for example, has a job where they appraise property by skydiving above it. If someone is able to make that job mundane, it says something about the individual. So write what you know. I think there is a level of research necessary for most bits of writing that involve something outside of one's own personal experience. And this is where a lot of modern day writers have sort of come from the journalism slant of things. Chuck Palahniuk started with journalistic type writing. Hemingway started as a journalist, things like that. And part of that is that you get to understand what the research into the details means. The second part that this question might mean, do you have to live a little in order to fill up that cup that you can then pour it out into these pieces of writing? Um, I don't know. This is a question that was posed to me when I was in graduate school from a writer whom I thought I respected at the time. She said to me, well, I told her I'm becoming a monk. That was really my goal through grad school. Don't really do a damn thing but live by the book, live by the pen, do all of these things that you can to ensure that you get as much out of this grad school experience as possible. And she was communicating with me on some form of social media. I don't know what it was. And she said, what do you do when you've written about all that you have to write about? I said, what? And she said, well, that's why, because we were sort of going back and forth about, I'm being a monk right now. I'm not coming back to St. Joe to do the bar scene with you. And she really sort of took that as her research was doing the bar scene, which, okay, I mean, hey, whatever you want to make it. But I think that if you have lived one day as an observant adult, and you were able to take that palette of feelings, of emotions, of experiences, of things, of thoughts, of theories about the world in that time, just one day you can write an entire life with. It is one day with which you can write an entire life, I guess I should say. But I don't think that it is necessary. I think a lot of times the questions about, well, what can a recluse really know about writing? All I have to do is point to Emily Dickinson. All I have to do is point at Ernest Hemingway and say, if the son of a bitch had calmed down for a little bit, what works of art might we have from him? So I think that it might be necessary to live a little in order to press the release valve from time to time. I don't think that it is completely necessary in order to, I don't think that is the research of writing. I really don't. You're going to run into enough heartbreak living your own life. You're going to run into enough humility living your own life. You're going to run into enough X, Y, Z, and all of the above, just living your own life, not making a point of going out to gain and garner the experiences. The second question comes from I'm a Savage Bruh, who asks, one book / novel / writer which is required to become an effective writer. One thing that I would urge is to search for symptoms, not diagnoses. That is to say, I don't really believe that writing manuals are all that helpful until you have your own theories of writing against which you might pit that other writer's theories of writing. It is also to say that I don't think inspiration is garbage. Inspiration is essentially worthless. I don't think that one should get all this wrapped up in being a writer as much as doing the writing. And I think that a lot of what you're going to come across in this search for writerdom, in this search for writerhood, in this search for being a writer, is the fact that none of it works unless you're writing. That said, if we're talking about books, I'm assuming this might all be the same question. It might just be one answer that I'm a Savage Bruh is looking for. But I think I'm going to break it down into the three: a book, a novel, and a writer. But even then, I'm going to be a wily little prick, and I'm not going to just give you straightforward answers. As far as book is concerned, I'm assuming that book would mean non-fiction, whereas novel would mean fiction. Or novel would just mean novel, and book could be a collection of short stories. However, what I'm going to do is give you another quote from Hemingway. The writer's job is not to understand, the writer's job is not to judge, but to seek to understand. And because of that, I think that biographies are a pretty big deal if you are a literary fiction writer. I think that history books are a pretty big deal if you are a fantasy type writer. And I think that there is probably a series of, or a classification of nonfiction that is important for every subset of fiction that you could imagine. But I think, so for me, biographies are instrumental. One of the most instrumental biographies that I read was by Robert V. Rimini. He wrote a biography about Andrew Jackson. And that biography of Andrew Jackson was utterly glowing. And it was as close to hero worship as anything I have ever read. And Andrew Jackson was an incredibly difficult individual, was an incredibly nuanced individual, was someone who, you know what, maybe nuance isn't even the right word. Andrew Jackson seemed to swim in his own self-contradiction. And part of the reason I give you that quote about the writer's job is not to judge, but to seek to understand. There are people in today's world who will tell you that you're a terrible person for even considering reading an Andrew Jackson biography. The one thing that's important to remember about those people, fuck them. Because your job is not to endorse Andrew Jackson. Your job is not to endorse anyone. Your job is to understand why that person was the way that they were, and how it is that a character in your writing might embody that same type of thing. One thing that we ran into on Strip Cover Lit recently was the incredibly difficult character in Absalom. Oh, Jesus Christ, now I'm forgetting his name. The character the story is basically all about. I can't believe I'm forgetting this name right now. But wasn't a great guy. But damn it, if you didn't look up to him, you know, there were so many conflicting things about this character that he was impossible to look away from. And if you can create a character like that, if you can create a character which is impossible to look away from, Thomas Sutpen, if you can create a character which is impossible to fully grasp in one go, like Thomas Sutpen, a character that is impossible to just wrap your hand around the way you might wrap your hand around a book, if you can create one of those characters, you've created something that runs away from the page. You've created something that will live with your reader in the way that to this day, Andrew Jackson lives with me because of the myriad things that he was a slave owner. He forced the Trail of Tears. But while he was attacking what he considered a lawless group of Native Americans, there was a child, a Native American child that was stranded on the battlefield. He adopted that child and raised it as his own. Lyota? I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but what a weird thing to do for someone who is that savage and cold-hearted, right? Regardless, it is something that he did. As far as novel, again, I want to refer back to that search for symptoms and not diagnoses. One of the things that is symptomatic of being a writer, but not diagnostic thereof, is the ability to play with ideas, and in fact, possibly the need to do so. So when one book that worked this way for me is Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. When I first read this story, number one, I've always been an underdog. So I read this in the 7th grade. I found this story as a short story and then read the novel. One thing that might not be, I don't know how many times I've shared this on the channel. When I was in grade school, we moved. My family moved, and I ended up going to 2 separate grade schools, kindergarten through 3rd grade at one, and 4th and 5th grade at another. At that first school, they thought I was gifted. I was one of the gifted kids, one of the smart kids. There was something called a SAGE program. And they wanted me to participate in that. Now, it would have meant a little bit of extra schooling. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I never got enrolled in it. When I moved to this second grade school, a grade school which was in a better part of town, I was supposed to take the special classes because I was so far behind the other kids. So that's a jarring experience, I think, for a kid. Over the course of one summer, you go from being praised for being gifted to you are in danger of being held back because you're special. So that stuck with me a little bit, and I found this story, Flowers for Algernon, in which Charlie is challenged and then is gifted with great intelligence. And for me, it felt like the opposite of what happened to me. So to be able to sort of delve into that experience in the opposite fashion was, it was the first time in writing that I was able to spot sort of myself or project myself onto a protagonist. But it was also something that was so jam-packed with ideas and possibilities. Steroids for the mind, right? Like, what would happen if that was a real thing? And I think it's something that pop culture has sort of become involved with. Look at all these nootropic drugs that pop up from time to time and are very in fad right now. But for me, the novel that triggered this sort of sense of wonderment through possibility in the means of writing was Flowers for Algernon. I think it is important to get your imagination caught on something. And much in the way that if you get a thread caught on an exposed nail, right, and you keep walking, it just sort of drags it back. When you get your imagination caught on something and you keep going, it's just teasing out little bits of imagination, and little bits of you stick there. And the longer they stick there, the opposite of threads, the stronger they become. And it becomes something that the machinations of your imagination sort of run with. As far as a writer which is required to become an effective writer. I'm really going to pick on effective here. What it means to be an effective writer. And I think, so far as I can understand, what it really means to be an effective writer is that you, as the writer, communicate through your words what it is that you wish to communicate. Now, I'm not talking about writing instruction manuals, and I'm not talking about writing propaganda. I'm talking about writing fiction. So in order to be an effective writer and write fiction, I think what you have to do is you have to find contrasting writers. Now, two writers that we've mentioned in this video, just to keep the palette as small as possible, Ernest Hemingway and William Faulkner, these individuals' writings contrast greatly. Hemingway was sparse on the page, a minimalist. William Faulkner is expansive on the page and could easily be described as a maximalist. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of each of these forms of writing? What do these forms of writing mean? Which forms of writing best suit your authorial voice? And then you have to make the decision which of these types of writings, which of these thematic elements really fit the story that you're going to tell. If you are telling a story about a cross-country truck driver, to use modern-day events, who doesn't want to deliver to areas where police have been defunded, would it make more or less sense for that individual to be a maximalist in their voice, in their would it make more sense for that person to be maximalized on the page or minimized on the page? I think the easy answer would be, oh, well, that's a minimalist type of voice, right? He's a cross-country truck driver. How many words does he really know? Anytime you get into that type of thought, I think you're in danger because you're painting with stereotypes. So maybe this individual is so paranoid to deliver goods to a place that has been defunded by police. Maybe he used to be a police officer and he was fired for something. What was he fired for? And why would he be putting in this amount of thought on where he's delivering these goods? I think that it is necessary. So the narrative voice in any piece must be a conscious decision. So when reading contrasting authors like Hemingway and Faulkner, why were the choices made that were indeed made? Why did we make those choices with the authorial voices, with the narrative voices? Here's a trick. Here's something I tried in grad school. I picked a Bukowski poem and an Emily Dickinson poem, wildly different writers, and I would try to write one of their poems in the other's voice. So what it really did was it really forced me to, so I died for beauty but was scarce adjusted in the tomb when one who died for truth was laying in an adjoining room. When you make truth and beauty someone who is addicted to cigars and someone who is addicted to whiskey, what happens there? And when you put them actually on the page in a Bukowski voice, what are you doing? What are the mechanisms that make that turn or not? So I think that is a roundabout way to say maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. Donnie Dewitt asks, what do you find a good daily word count for writing? How many words do you write per day? Right now I'm on a kick where I'm writing 300 words per day. There is a story, probably apocryphal, about James Joyce, where one of his artiste friends stumbled upon him in the middle of his writing day, and Joyce was prostrate. He was absolutely depressed. And the friend says to him, he says, "Hey, James, how you doing?" And James says, "Awful, miserable, terrible, the shits." And the friend says, "Okay, so you're writing. How many words have you got today?" And James Joyce says, "Oh, been writing for 8 hours and I have 16 words. His friend says, 16 words? James, that's quite the pace for you. That's prolific for you. 16 words is a great day of productivity for the way that you normally write." And James says, yes, indeed it is. But now I have to figure out what order I'm going to put them in. I tell you that to tell you this. There you will come across no shortage of individuals who's willing to tell you you have to write 500 words per day. And if you do not, you are simply not a writer. You're just not a writer. You have to give up. One, that person's an idiot and that person's full of shit. Two, that is a clear defense mechanism. That is a clear defense mechanism. The most prolific author of our day is possibly Stephen King. I'm going to make this reference again. Stephen King says the only thing you have to do to be a writer is to write. Stephen King says the only thing you have to do to be a pretty good writer is maybe you got something published and you were able to pay the light bill. This is a man who has written more books than God and who has earned more money than, I don't know. What do you have a literary reference for that? But Lex Luthor, more money than Lex Luthor from his written words. So if that's what he's willing to tell you, and some other yagoff is going to tell you that you have to write 500 words a day in order to be a writer. Don't listen to them. And Stephen King, I think his daily word count is 3,000. Madness, utter madness, insanity. But I don't think it is necessary to have a word count for the day. Earlier I said make sure you look for symptoms and not diagnoses. I think part of that, as far as being a writer is concerned, is that what you really want to do is make sure you're writing. So I think that there are so many different ways. What's the old saying? There's 1,000 ways to skin a cat, or whatever. Writing is more difficult, but less messy than skinning a cat. Writing is less humane than skinning a cat. We need to get rid of more cats. But what I'm trying to say is there will be times where what you are doing is wasting your time with writing. When I was, I'll use the example before I went to grad school. I had set for myself the goal to write 1,000 words a day. Now, in order to make that realistic for myself at the time, working 2 or 3 jobs, I can't remember, as well as trying to stay fit, as well as trying to skin cats and all the other things that you do in a day. What I was doing, one of those was a manual labor job, which was outside during what must have been the hottest summer on. It was just awful. I was up on a ladder, scraping paint, getting it all over myself, covered in lead paint, so that'll tell you a thing or two about how that summer was going. Part of what I had to do to make that realistic was I had to not strictly count productive words. If I had it on paper, it counted, baby. So a lot of times what I will do is I will start with free writing or journaling, and what that does is it really gets things going, and then you can get into things. So what I was doing is there would be days where all I would do was the journaling or the exploratory writing or the free writing in order to get into the mood to write, and I never got around to the productive stuff because I was just spent. So I recognized that and said, okay, this is stupid. This is dumb. I'm wasting time not getting anything out of it by saying I have to have 1,000 words. What does 1,000 words do for me? Absolutely but fucking nothing, as long as they are just free writing or journaling or exploratory writing. So I would say, okay, let's have a heart-to-heart. 200 productive words a day. You don't have to write anything else. So I would get into these 200 words. All of a sudden 200 words becomes 1,000 because you're really in the stream of writing. You're really in the zone. But then other day, so maybe you finish an entire short story. Maybe you finish an entire flash fiction. And the next day, you're kind of spent. But you got this idea. You got this idea for a poem. You noticed something when you were on the top of your ladder covered in lead paint. It was a great observation. So you get that down, which is 70 words. But you've got to move on. And you've got to do other stuff instead of taking the time to really edit it, to get that poem ready, more ready to send out, get a second draft done, get a third iteration started, So that stops working as well. And there's other things that you can do. So a time limit. There are times in my life where I have to go back to, okay, you have to write for an hour every day. And what that does is it really helps you sit down and get started. So you're going to find different things that motivate you at different times in life. And I think that's not a bad thing. So the first time I really did this for myself was way back when. Like I had to go out and buy I I was in the gutters at this point a little bit. And I went out and bought myself a desk and a notebook, which were big expenditures for me at the time. And by desk, I mean one of those flimsy card tables that has this much padding on top. You fold it open. That was my desk. I'm not ashamed of it, but not the greatest desk. And I told myself, to make this worth it, to make it worth the fact that you went out and did this, you're going to have to write a poem every day. And I did that for 100 days. At the end of it, I was a more experienced poem writer. I don't know that I was a better poem writer, but it was definitely a formative experience. One of my very first experiences with having an audience at writing was during my second year away at college. I decided to form a writers group. Now, in this writers group, I think we had 10 weeks in a summer that we were working with before we had to go back to school, after we'd started, before we go back to school. So we had 10 weeks. We had to write 9 stories. So everybody got one pass week during which they would turn in a revision of one of their former stories. This was great. It was a great summer. I urge and encourage everyone to do their best in their life if they consider themselves a writer, and if you made it 30 minutes into a video like this, you really do, to find a group of peers in order that you can do this with each other. Absolutely, absolutely formative as far as considering oneself a serious writer. So that was writing a story every week. A lot of times there were days in there where you don't get any writing done. A lot of times there were days in there where you're proofreading what you've already written because you know there's going to be another pair of eyes on it, and you think, does this sentence really make sense? So I think there's a lot of different ways outside of a daily word count that one can really profit as a writer and grow their expectations. The final question in today's video comes to us back from Ina. In a previous video, I had talked about how I've got 10 pieces published. I think it's like 6 stories and 4 poems or something like that. If you want to go way back, I probably got 15 or 16. I got quite a few poems published in my early days, just in different places. She asks, why is it you haven't submitted anything in so long? Because in a previous video, I had talked about how I haven't submitted anything since 2014, I believe it is. I'm not sure I agree with the world of writing as it stands right now. I'm pretty sure I do not. I'm pretty sure I disagree with the world of publication as it currently stands. And I don't trust the social climate. I just don't. Because anyone look, I write stuff that is not nice or kind. That is not nice, for sure. If anyone is here on my Patreon, I put 2 pieces of writing on Patreon every month. There's a lot of stuff in there that's not, like, a lot of stuff gets you canceled in today's world. And when you start talking about the metaphor underneath people's writing, the metaphor underneath someone's writing is dangerous these days. I don't think that the paradigm of today's publication, of today's writerly types, I don't think this paradigm is sustainable. I don't think that it can go on the way it is. I think that there will be some type of upheaval. So there's a website called Duotrope, and it's basically the writer's market, but for the internet age. And get on there and just see the sheer number of publications these days. And I'm not saying there's not good stuff that gets published. I'm not saying there's not good publishers. I'm not saying there aren't gatekeepers who are worth doing what they're doing. What I'm saying is that I don't know that I trust any of them. I don't know that I trust anyone. I think that in today's world, the next step is people creating their own platforms. Um, that's part of it. Part of it is a genuine lack of confidence. Part of it is I don't have all the time in the world to give towards writing. So do I want to write new stuff, or do I want to edit old stuff? There is a that is a problem. Part of it is, I don't know. There's a the problems are myriad, and there's no. I don't know if I fit, right? Now, that's not a reason not to try, but I think that it's maybe a reason to sit out for a little while. I think that it's maybe a reason to have serious conversations with yourself. Now, whether or not these conversations need to last 6 years, as they have, maybe there's a discussion to be had there. But I don't know. There's so many reasons that I really haven't submitted anything that it's a question I need to ask myself. So thank you, Ina.